from my Yiddish heritage, and holds a master's degree in Mexican literature from the
outsider. Say is one which neither is exercised, is not even accurate, is inherent and attribute. Makes two sense. 1/4, which demonstrates within biological descent or race, and 1 week as cultural descent or inheritance. That it will be equivalent to the Western idea about ethnicity, and in turn it will have a way weaker than its known and lifestyle. Lovecraft will travel gradually from his youth to his maturity, from the sense of biological descent to that of cultural descent with regard to ethnicity. Lovecraft considered himself a descendant from the Britons and from the Anglo-Saxon. His Anglophile is well known, but he weighed his identification in the cultural side with Rome and the Latin one. For example, Lovecraft wrote to Robert H. Barlow on 13 June 1936, undeniable, my own blood kinsfolk on the continent interests me less than my cultural kinsfolk, whose blood diverges sharply from my own as the stream recedes in the time. The northern nation, biological taking to me, seem foreign and of a minor interest. Whilst France, Italy, and Greece, the successive cultural precursor of the Anglo-Norman civilization around me, seem close, ancestral, and of vital personal interest. To me, the Roman Empire will always seem the central incident of the human history, and this perspective cannot but color, both consciously or inconsciously, my national interest and literary appreciation in connection with the modern world. Lovecraft. Therefore, I will consider the personal identity of the same Lovecraft in the context of his epoch and the society, for which I use the book Stigma, Note on the Management of Spoiled Identity by Irving Lockman, with regard to the concept of stigma, that is an attribute discredit of the person for being incongruous with his stereotype, and the use of the biography, using so much of the Lovecraft's autobiographical writings as works of his principal biographers, especially Sprague de Camp, Kenneth Fay, and Esta. Let's think that in Lovecraft we might find a person stigmatized from the infancy, since when his family belongs to the local aristocracy of his dear Providence, he might turn as an outsider for three principal reasons. First, on not having had his father together with him. Product of the syphilis that confined Winfield Scott Lovecraft in a psychiatric hospital where he would die a little time later. Lovecraft developed his Anglophile to identify with his father. Second, for the overprotection he suffered from his mother, Sarah Susan Phillips, on having dressed the small Howard like a girl, and later, towards the beginnings of the adolescent, to force him to adopt a very Victorian weak and sickly stereotype which would cause certain reject from part of his classmates, beside which his own mother would stress his ugliness, and the later Lovecraft told it to his wife Sonia. Third, the loss of the familiar lot after the death of his grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips, situation that plunged Lovecraft in a strong depression. Nevertheless, in this occasion, I will deal especially in the second one. I will bear in mind the aspect of the manliness, a concept analyzed by Gail Bederman principally in remaking manhood through the race and civilization. The first chapter of her book, Manliness and Civilization, a Cultural History of Gender and Race in the United States, 1808 and 1917, which correspond rightly to the period in which Lovecraft lived and will relate into the biographical subject science. It turns out to be vital to understand his later political trends and evolution thought. I sustain that the Victorian model of manliness centered on the aristocracy nobleness imposed by Sarah Susan, which is diverse to the one extent during the transition between the 19th century to the 20th century, that was based on the virility as well as the custom of the conservative society in which Lovecraft lived. They are responsible for much for the behavior and identity that Lovecraft would forge in his youth, coming out in some cases up to his adult stage to the fact that Lovecraft was seeking to remake his masculinity. The premise that Bederman argues, which centers on the manliness and the race, is exactly the one the white men of the middle class in the United States employed actively between 1890 and 1917 for the purpose of reaffirming the masculine power and based on the idea that their race was the determinant factor for their genre. To understand Lovecraft's feeling about remaking his manhood, we must consider several factors that Bederman herself illustrated in her books. First, when she narrates that in the last decade of the 19th century, in the face of the capitalism, many men of the middle class began to work as sellers, and that the following generation, their children, faced the real possibility that traditional source of male power and status would remain closer to them forever. The case is very similar to Lovecraft's relative, since his father, who was scarcely known by him due to his premature disease and death, was a traveling salesman working for the Gorham and Company. Second, she comments on several of the strategies to make evident the manliness and the invasion of the masculinity. Among others, there is the membership to diverse fraternities and the accomplishment of sports practice as a way of avoiding the epithet of effeminate, sissy, or pussyfoot. Such activities show a bridge between the stereotype of the manliness in the Victorian epoch and following, fixing the masculinity. Sarah Susan Phillips inculcated to her son the old Victorian model that Lovecraft would reject deeply, situation that brought onto him as a consequence, and among many other problems, the years of the son of his classmate, who nicknamed him Lovey, in the Slater Avenue School, or his disability to relate better to those that were approaching him in the Hope Street High School. Attending to the previous matter, in terms of logical to think that in his youth, Lovecraft therefore was seeking to reaffirm his masculinity with writings like that published in the amateur press, especially in the conservative. In 1917, Lovecraft tried to join the American Army to fight in the First World War, but his mother did not allow it. It's probable that the fierce approximation that Lovecraft had with the fascists obeys to his need to remake the manhood. Third, another aspect Bederman indicates is that the speech of civilization was a powerful, effective way to link male dominance to white supremacy. Argument that Lovecraft will take again, but from certain critical point in his essays of the epoch near to the American entry into the First World War, such is the case of the Renaissance of manhood, 1915, where Lovecraft said, after the degrading debauch of the craven pacifism from which our solid and feminist public has lately floundered, a slight sense of shame seems to be appearing, and the outcries of peace and any praise maniacs are less violent than they are few months ago. Also, in the final paragraph, he refers to the speech of Theodore Roosevelt on 25 August 1915 about the American public sentiment, and Lovecraft adds, "It is the beginning of the end of supine submissiveness and womanish ideals on the part of the majority." Though there are some points of critique in Lovecraft's position with regard to this aside. In his maturity is where he will develop his well-known thought. The previous issues were but a brief sample of the study of the Lovecraft identities, which I developed in my doctoral thesis, of which the principal argument consists in demonstrating how Lovecraft's personality identity transforms eventually in the collective one, when we fans of his life and work become identified with him, for which we can observe the shadow out of an outsider. Thank you very much.
Our last paper this morning is from Jason Ray Carney. It is entitled Monstrous